All right, Colin Dickey joins me now. He's a cultural historian, the author of multiple books on the mysterious and our connection to them, aliens, ghosts, and now he's written this book, Under the Eye of Power: How the Fear of Secret Societies Shapes American Democracy. Colin, good to be talking to you today.
Oh my God, thanks so much for having me on.
So I wanted to mention, you've written about aliens. That's a hot topic these days in Washington. You've been following the developments there.
I have, yes, yes. People are very excited about aliens right now, and they will again in the future, no doubt. So,
But let's get to your new book here about secret societies, conspiracies, how they shape our democracy. This is something that comes up in the news all the time. I feel like I'm trying to slap down various conspiracies on a weekly basis, daily basis, depending on the week. It often revolves around they are trying to do something, they are trying to control us. What inspired you to dive into this topic?
right, okay, yeah. So as you mentioned, my last book was on aliens, among other things. Cryptids and the lost city of Atlantis. I was sort of interested in these kind of borderland places where monsters would hide. And in the course of writing that book, in the course of writing a sort of history of our fascination with both, Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and also aliens, one of the things that struck me was that, if you either believe in the Loch Ness Monster or you don't, whatever. But you don't, nobody believes that the lack of definitive proof of the Loch Ness Monster is due to a government cover up. Whereas if you believe in aliens, I think, it is axiomatic that you also believe in some kind of government cover-up. I don't know anybody who believes that aliens are real, but that their existence has not been monitored, tracked, suppressed somehow by government forces.
Well, and frankly, that was a subject of recent congressional hearings. I mean, with
sure, yeah,
very specific accusations.
Yeah, of course, yeah, and those accusations go back since the 40s, through the modern sort of UFO, kind of excitement. And this is why the story that everybody was very excited about this idea that now we have this guy, an intelligence officer is on the record, his name is on the record, he's filed a whistleblower report, and people are sort of like, oh my God, this has never been done before. We've never heard from somebody in the government saying that there's a government conspiracy, except that we have, and we do on the regular. There's a book from 1951 by Donald Kehoe, where he interviews a number of Air Force and Navy officers who allege that there's a cover up. So this has been with us. It's sort of that's why I said it sort of cycles constantly. We sort of forget that somebody has gone on the record, and we forget that nothing came of it. So in 5 years from now, somebody will come forward and say on the record, the government is covering things up, and everybody will say, well, this has never happened before, because they'll have completely forgotten summer of 2023, like they forgot the summer of 2017 and the summer of 2004, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So anyways, so that book, to go back to answer your question, I mean, that book sort of ends kind of in the world of conspiracy and conspiracy theories, and sort of how our fascination with wonder and with the idea that there could be something more out there in the world, something beyond science or religion, quickly becomes paranoid, for lack of a better term. And so with this book, it's in some ways a continuation, although the focus is very different. But it was again an attempt to sort of understand why we are attracted to and fascinated by, as you put it, this idea of them, this idea of a group that is invisible to the naked eye, but somehow their effect is everywhere. And that, the way people construct these stories around either, completely fictitious secret societies like the Illuminati, or, daycare Satanists, or, very real, groups or ethnicities or societies, but, who are, totally benign, the Freemasons, the Jews, etc. I was really fascinated by that need to sort of create a kind of mythical resonance to these secret groups, and that's what drove it.
The first line of your book: "The United States was born in paranoia." You talk about how we think of a couple of these panics, whether the witch trials, etc., as aberrations, but you write, "They're as American as apple pie." Sort of takes me to the Mark Twain quote that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. and you take us through 4 centuries of American history. Talk to me about that line. The U.S. was born in paranoia. Conspiracies are as American as apple pie.
Sure. I mean, yeah, like that. I think, again, when I started this book, I think I held the common belief that I think a lot of people believe that, Trump in 2016 was something of an anomaly. It was the first time we had a American president who was openly espousing conspiracy theories. And everybody's like, wow, this has never happened before. And so when I started to do the research, this has happened repeatedly. Nixon was, of course, a famous anti-Semite.
Right. Many of those caught on audio tape.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. Abraham Lincoln, as it turns out, rose to the presidency on the back of a conspiracy theory that I talk about in the book, that, at the time was referred to as the slaveocracy, that powerful slave owners in the South had infiltrated the American government and had corrupted it from within. But also, to go back to the very beginning, George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, all in various ways, were, if not open subscribers, at least amenable to the idea that the Illuminati had not only destroyed France and was responsible for the bloody end of the French Revolution, but were at any moment going to infiltrate the United States. This was sort of a common thing. There's also, a number of conspiracy theories that were floated around the time of the American Revolution that the whole thing was a put on by France to distract England and divide its resources so that France could conquer England.
So it's interesting. So forget 2016. Yeah. You talk about the election of 1800. You talk about the Illuminati. You talk about George Washington believing there's a cabal behind King George III. Talk to me more about that. Let's begin with the Illuminati. Who are the Illuminati? Because that's one of the kind of original theories that's out there that still stands today.
Right. So the Illuminati was basically it was a fraternal secret organization in Bavaria modeled on the Freemasons. They, sort of upper class Bavarian men who were interested in things like equal rights for women, birth control, atheism.
When is this?
Things like that. This is the 1770s. Okay. So they're only around for about 9 years before the Bavarian government, infiltrates them and then suppresses them and, sort of drives them out of existence. That is the end of the Illuminati as a literal legitimate organization, 1789 or something like that. But
so this was very fresh. This was fresh for the people of the George Washington era.
Sure, but it was not. It was not international news. It was not anything that anybody knew about or anybody cared about. Until the French Revolution, and a Catholic priest named Burrell, who was looking at what had happened in France, looking at his country, looking at how the church had been sort of driven out by these violent, bloody atheists, and in an attempt to sort of understand what had happened, he proposed this theory that what if this organization that has been defunct in Bavaria for a decade actually secretly lived and was responsible for the French Revolution, and sort of advocates the first kind of conspiracy theory that the Illuminati were responsible for the French Revolution and by extension could influence world events from behind the scenes.
So the Illuminati is the first QAnon.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, unless you want to go back to Salem, in which case, witches, Salem is very similar to QAnon in the sense of what if your neighbor who just looks like a normal everyday housewife, Goody Brown, is secretly in league with the devil and doing weird sex stuff in the forest, and that's why your cow died. It's all there. It's all in Salem.
And these witch trials, this is the we're going back another 100 years now to nearly 350 years ago in Massachusetts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and and again, what I talk about in the book is that I think historically we have this tendency to look at Salem and McCarthy, and we look at as the two kind of aberrational moments in American history when things got a little out of hand, people got swept up in paranoia. And the only reason we talk about McCarthy, frankly, is because I think Arthur Miller's The Crucible gets taught, and it connects it to Salem.
You're talking Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, 1950s communist panic in the U.S.
Yeah, the Red Scare in the 50s. So we look at the Salem Witch Trials, we look at the Red Scare of the 50s, and we say these were two moments when paranoia swept the community, the country. Things got out of hand, and innocent people were persecuted. But as you mentioned, in your referencing Mark Twain, I mean, yeah, like this happens. This rhymes over and over again. We see the blueprint of QAnon, and what I talk about in the book is we see the blueprint of QAnon not just in Salem and the Illuminati panic of the 1790s, but the anti-Catholic panic of the 1830s, the rise of the Second Klan in the 1920s. So these things sort of appear over and over again, and what the book attempts to do, and again, we could talk about these individually, but just as a sense, like the book attempts to sort of connect these things and say these were not in fact one-offs, sort of outside the norm. These are in fact baked into how Americans run culture, run society.
Is there something, I mean, you mentioned the Illuminati thing sort of comes out of Europe. Is there something uniquely American here? I don't know if you've been able to do a comparative study here, but in terms of American ethos versus, the British or the Italians or the Russians, are other societies as prone to this as we are?
Oh, I mean, definitely they are. Yeah. And certainly every society has its conspiracy theories. When you write about sort of urban legends and fringe topics, I think it helps to be a member of that community. I think I try and stay away from statements like, the Italians believe, or, Hindus think this, because I would not put myself in a position to say those things, which is why I decided for this book and my last two to really focus on American subcultures. But what I will say is that the two aspects of America that are not unique to America, but certainly really exacerbate this. I think there are two things, one of which is democracy, frankly. I mean, again, like the 2020 election being the most obvious example. When the election doesn't go your way, it can be very tempting for some people to disregard the results and say instead, there is a conspiracy, a cabal of elites has stolen the election from us, and again, and that's a thing that gets trotted out. I remember getting trotted out in 2004 when Kerry lost to Bush, being told that Karl Rove had stolen Ohio and these kinds of things. So that's one thing. I think democracy just sort of breeds that receptivity for conspiracy theories. The other thing, which again is not unique to America, but is really baked into our DNA, is that these conspiracy theories are often used to mitigate the cultural prominence of new immigrants. So whenever there's a new wave of immigrants and, Americans who are here view them with suspicion or distrust or do not want to sort of assimilate their culture, oftentimes conspiracy theories will swirl up around them, around, the Catholics or the Italians or even the Irish, certainly, Muslim Americans, certainly Jewish Americans. Like we've seen this again and again. So those things are by no means unique to America, but they're really part of who we are.
Yeah, I want to talk about immigration in a second, but back to the late 1700s there, we discussed briefly the Illuminati, and I would love for you to kind of discuss, you talked about the election of 1800 and the various conspiracies. I mean, I'm fascinated because we're going into another election cycle here, and every election cycle, it feels, at least in the modern age, but it looks like it went back to the origins of this country, have general conspiracies about them, what the other side will do to us, who the other major candidate is in league with. Take us back to that Jefferson-Adams election.
Right. So, and again, this was a thing I found so fascinating because I think for, like many people, I thought that 2016 was really the first election that we were going to see that was where the actual sort of discourse was being controlled and mobilized through conspiracy theories of various kinds. But 1800 was the third presidential election, the first contested one after Washington chose not to run for a third term. So what happened was the panic of the Illuminati having supposedly caused the French Revolution sort of seeped over to the United States. John Adams supporters in the Northeast, places like, people like Timothy Dwight, who was the president of Yale University, and Jedediah Morse, who was Samuel Morse, the telegraph inventor's father, began sort of spreading this conspiracy theory that the Illuminati had infiltrated America through the Freemasons, that Thomas Jefferson could not be trusted, that he was a stooge for the Illuminati. And they started sort of whipping up a panic about this. The 1798 passage of the Alien and Sedition Act was in part motivated by a fear of foreign saboteurs. The Illuminati aren't named in the act, but that was the kind of thing that was very prevalent at the time. This idea that there are foreign nationals who are bent on destroying American democracy, and they are infiltrating us on the regular, and we must protect against them. What happened ultimately, though, which again I found very fascinating, was that a priest he wasn't a priest, but he was a sort of, I think, like a Presbyterian minister of some kind, who was sort of disgraced and sort of ran out of New England because he sort of didn't fit the culture, ended up in Philadelphia, was a supporter of Jefferson, or at least was not a supporter of John Adams and his allies, and began publishing articles basically turning the accusation back against Adams supporters, back against Timothy Dwight and Jedediah Morse, accusing them of being part of the Illuminati. And it turns out that this kind of like paranoid accusation really, is the first time people sort of realized you didn't really have to have any sort of evidence or even like a stable ideology. You could just point at your political opponent and say, there's something fishy about these guys. Perhaps they're in league with a foreign power. And it took off and it worked. And, so these two rival presidential candidates, or at least their camps, were banding accusations that the other one was a member of the Illuminati, or at least a stooge of the Illuminati. And it played a significant part in the election of 1800.
One other secret group, so you talked Illuminati. One other secret group that gets a lot of attention are the Freemasons. Oftentimes, I'll go take a walking historical tour of a city, and or some sort of historical tour, and they'll be like, X was a Freemason, and Y was a Freemason, and this was built by the Freemasons. And it never seems like anyone I ever speak to has like a firm grasp of who these people are, and they're still couched in mystery after all these centuries.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so they start as a literal trade union, who are, for stonecutters, hence the name, people who work in stone, in the 12th or 13th century, something like that. It's their actual origins are a little sort of lost to time. But at some point, they begin accepting sort of non-actual Masons into the Freemasonry, men who are not, tradesmen. And again, how and when that happens is again sort of lost to history. We don't exactly know. We know the first guy to sort of sign up for the Freemasons, who clearly wasn't a Mason, was an English sort of alchemist, Scottish alchemist sort of nobleman in the 16th century.
Okay.
But was he the first? It's hard to say. It's just the first we know of. By the time Freemasonry comes to America, which it comes to pretty early, and after the Europeans start sort of colonizing and displacing native cultures, we have this organization which is a tightly bound fraternity of upper class men who sort of swear an oath to secrecy. So their meetings are private. It has become a great place for forward progressive thinkers to meet and be able to discuss things like democracy or atheism without fear that the king's henchmen are going to find out and stick them in jail. So it attracts a kind of free thinker, somewhat of a radical person, who wants to be able to sort of discuss ideas in open or in without sort of being afraid of being found out. And when it comes to America, what I was not expecting to find in the book, what I found really fascinating was that Americans, they, at least the founders who were trying to figure out how to sort of, create this new country, they didn't want the hereditary aristocracy of the British. They wanted to reject this idea that you had to be born into it. But they also clearly wanted a hierarchy. They wanted, they wanted a kind of caste of elites. And I think of, somebody like Benjamin Franklin, sort of one of the most famous Freemasons, as somebody who saw himself as a kind of first among equals, and not even in a kind of obnoxious way, just in the sense of like, very civic minded, very much, founding, fire departments and libraries, and really sort of like putting himself out as like, there needs to be a kind of leading group of American citizens who will sort of set the tone. And belonging to the Freemasons was a way of sort of signifying caste and a sort of elite status without it having anything to do with ancestry or birth. And that's sort of why people like Franklin wanted to join. That's why George Washington, who was not born into money and was sort of a solidly middle class dude, but was an inveterate social climber, knew that one of the great ways to get ahead in America was by joining the Masons, which he did. So that's kind of who they are in the 18th century. By the 19th century, they start to sort of change dramatically as their numbers grow bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're less able to maintain that sort of aura of elites and being first among equals.
I want to talk immigration here and how that's played into panics and conspiracies through the years. You mentioned the anti-Catholic push 1830s through 1850s. That as we start to see immigrants come in from Germany, from Ireland, especially as sort of the Protestant majority in the country started to be outnumbered in cities, especially. And then theories related to, we're going to be enslaved by the Pope, or the fact that you're Catholic means you can't partake in a democracy because, ultimately you report to the Pope. By the way, this came up even in the JFK election, right, in 1960, as he became the first Catholic elected president. What I found fascinating, and I want to discuss the Catholic thing, but also the grooming accusations against Catholics. It's fascinating because we sit here today and the headlines are related, especially when it comes to the LGBT community, trans community, grooming. They're groomers. Tom Hanks is a pedophile groomer. Oprah is a pedophile groomer. And you trace this back 200 years to the early 1800s and the anti-Catholic panic.
Yeah, exactly. And so in 1834, there's a convent outside of Boston in what is now Somerville, next to Cambridge, where the well-heeled elite of Protestant Boston send their daughters to be educated, the Ursuline convent. There is a growing suspicion in the early decades, kind of, as you're just saying, that, as more and more Catholics are coming to the United States, that Catholics cannot be trusted to participate in American democracy, that they are being given their marching orders by a foreign power, the Pope, and that their allegiance to Catholic dogma trumps their allegiance to American democracy, and thus they can't be trusted, and they shouldn't be allowed to be citizens. And again, this is verbatim the same playbook that is now being used against Muslim Americans in Sharia law. This idea that Muslim Americans will follow Sharia law over American laws, and thus are sort of bad American citizens. So this was originally used against Catholics, and so this kind of conspiracy theory starts to develop, that the Catholic priest through the confessional is able to exert a kind of control over women that is kind of half blackmail, half mind control, and that Catholic priests are subjugating the women in this convent, these Protestant, teenage and young adult women, into sort of various sexual depravity, various, kind of nightmare scenarios that seem straight out of 2016's Pizzagate and the sort of QAnon grooming sort of accusations. The main difference, and again, I found this really fascinating researching the book, is that in the original version, it is not children; it is primarily adult, or at least like teenage women who are the victims. And this playbook won't get changed to focus on children until the 70s with the rise of feminism, basically. So these people become convinced that these women are being abused in this sort of torture dungeon, which is this convent. They're producing, as a result of these rapes, they're, being impregnated, and the infants are being murdered and buried in the basement. And, again, you think of like the Pizzagate accusations that Comet Pizza in Washington, D.C. has this basement where terrible things are going on. And of course, Comet Pizza has no basement. But this ultimately leads to, in August of 1834, a riot, which turned out to be quite mellow and laid back. There was not a lot of spontaneity about it. There was just a sort of kind of growing, when you read the letters and the accounts of these people, it's sort of just like a kind of, hey, if you're not doing anything Monday, we're going to burn down the convent. You should come join us, and sure enough, they do. They get all the women out, and they, proudly proclaim, we're liberating you. And these women are basically like, you're kicking me out of my home. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. They go down to the basement expecting to find all these corpses of infants. Of course, they find nothing other than, like a burial chamber for, priests and nuns, which they promptly desecrate. And then they burn the thing to the ground. And that, one of the things I found very funny is that, Boston, of all cities, is very proud of its riots. I mean, it's all, the Boston Tea Party is a founding myth of Boston. Bostonians love talking about how they riot either over tea or the Red Sox or whatever. But this riot has been all but obliterated from, Massachusetts history. And I think, there's something about that historical amnesia that I try to sort of discuss again in the book, and why we write some stories out of the history of records.
When it comes to immigration, so there's the Catholic immigration that continues over several decades, and then there's Chinese immigration to the U.S. Then there's the Jewish immigration to the U.S., and they come from a variety of places: Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, etc. It seems like the anti-Jewish conspiracies take on a different bent than the anti-Catholic conspiracies.
Yeah, and it's a really strange thing. I mean, when I say that there's something specific and unique about anti-Semitism, I don't in any way mean to downplay any of the other, bigotry and racism that is leveled against other groups, and I think they're all horrible and miserable. But structurally, anti-Semitism is a very weird ideology. It's unlike say anti-Black racism, which sort of presumes a kind of superiority of white people. Anti-Semitism simultaneously sort of argues that Jews are, degenerate and subordinate, quote unquote, but also have immense amounts of power, are in control of everything. And I think that it's a bigotry which is bound up in a series of purposeful paradoxes. Jews are simultaneously alleged to be rapacious capitalists, sort of hyper capitalists who are only interested in money and the accumulation of money, and simultaneously accused of being Bolshevik communists, right, who are out to destroy capitalism. So there's all these paradoxes that exist in anti-Semitism, which is fairly unique to its constitution, and that's because I think ultimately there's something almost sort of like, what I sort of describe and sort of, map in the second half of the book is conspiracy theories sort of gradually take on an almost sort of quasi-theological aspect. The guy who coins the term conspiracy theory in 1947, Karl Popper, has this line, the conspiracy theory of society happens when you get rid of God and ask what's in its place. To presuppose that the Illuminati or the Jews are quote unquote behind it all is a way of basically saying to yourself that everything that happens has a cause, even if it doesn't make sense, no matter what is going on, whether or not it's, the war in Ukraine or the reason I got a flat tire, it's because, the Jews run the media or whatever. It's this idea that there's this, that the Jews, again, to follow Karl Popper, that the Jews have replaced God as the catch-all explanatory mechanism of society. And no matter how weird and confusing the day-to-day world is, the only possible explanation is as part of this terrible plan that is known only to the elders of Zion, and it's coming to fruition before our eyes.
It's fascinating because, having covered Washington for nearly 2 decades, people always want to describe there's some sort of plan. There's a plan. I was like, people in Washington, a lot of them are pretty incompetent in what they do. Sometimes it's just, there's always this need to ascribe malicious intent for things that are sometimes just pure incompetence.
Oh, yeah. What's the line in All the President's Men, which I come back to again and again, is, the truth is these aren't very bright men and things got out of hand. I think that, that explains a great deal of what we're seeing. But, I think, one of the things that I talk about in the book again is if you want like an actual literal conspiracy, one that is not a fictitious conspiracy theory, I think, the Iraq War counts in the sense that you have a group of powerful politicians in America who decided they wanted to go to war, invented a story that we now universally all recognize as being fictitious, as a means of sort of building support for this war. But that's like, these are the most powerful men in the world. This is the world's the best army human history has ever seen, set out with a very deliberate plan, and they screwed it up. They couldn't make it happen.
Yeah.
So like actual conspiracies can be successful, but are subject to the same amount of chaos and randomness and unpredictability that modern day life is. But a conspiracy theorist sort of refuses to admit that. The whole idea about a conspiracy theory is that it's perfect and it's always flawlessly executed. There's always a sense that everything that is happening because the Illuminati or whomever is doing things exactly according to plan.
Well, we saw this a lot in the 2020 election aftermath, right? Where Q's like, wait, you just wait. The day that they're going to arrest Biden is March 22nd. Trump's going to take over again in August. And it just continues. And despite the fact, and I'd love for you to explain kind of what happens here kind of psychologically, despite the fact that like this one was wrong and that call was wrong and that call was wrong and that call was wrong, people still continue to believe and stay committed.
Well, sure. This is like your garden variety, mall psychic, right? Somebody reading your palm or your fortune. How does that work? They throw a lot of things throw a lot of darts at the wall, see what you respond to. They get a couple lucky coincidences, and then from there, you forget all of the misses. You focus on the hits, and so QAnon, like Nostradamus, like all of these things, is a system where you just throw out as many different ideas, and when one of them is right, you say, "Oh, look, I'm a psychic," and when one of them is wrong, you forget about it and you move on.
One of the things you delve into is conspiracies on the right versus the left. How each side develops theirs. I mean, obviously, you talk much more about the right here. Talk to me about how each side develops its theories. I mean, actually, one of the interesting examples we just discussed is anti-Semitism, where anti-Semitism on the right is, these people are below us. Anti-Semitism on the left is these people are the elites controlling everything.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think, I went into this with a, fairly open mind. I found that this particular version of conspiracy theory, the idea of a secret society, is almost always mobilized by the right. But, it's not entirely. And I think, most commonly, there's the kind of anti-government conspiracy theories that, that are popular on the left. And again, not without evidence. The CIA and the FBI are two of the organizations that I talk about in the book that like actually would fit the definition of most conspiracy theorists' definition of a secret society. A group working together behind the scenes to violate American laws is something that's been true of both the CIA and the FBI, and it sort of created this perpetual paranoia on the left about the American government.
Right. There's reasonable evidence to understand why people believe certain things might happen based on just the recent history of what J. Edgar Hoover and the CIA in the 60s and 70s was up to.
Sure, of course, yeah. And so again, for what I'm interested in terms of the left is that moment when it ceases to be sort of based on evidence and probability and moves in again to this idea of a kind of quasi-theological explanation for the world. If you believe that, fossil fuel companies are, just terrible capitalists who are all, basically extracting as much wealth they can while the party's going without any care to the future, that seems sane and normal to me. If you see global warming as part of a nefarious plot organized by oil company executives who are, engineering world events to their benefit, again, suddenly it's moved into this larger explanatory mechanism for the chaos and the randomness of the world. And that's to me where it sort of shades into a conspiracy theory rather than just a kind of, critique of an industry or something like that.
So some modern numbers here. Half of Americans believe the U.S. government is hiding a new world order or some sort of Illuminati. 1/5 of Americans believe in Illuminati control of the world. 1 out of 4 Americans believe that 9/11 was coordinated or allowed to happen in some way by the U.S. government against ourselves. 1 out of 6 Americans, this is a scary one, believe the global system is controlled by Satan-worshipping pedophiles. Where are we, historically speaking? I mean, I imagine you don't have good survey Gallup data from 1790, 1850, 1940, But we do speak right now, Colin, at a time of rampant mistrust for the government and institutions.
Yeah, we sure do. And, one of the things I found is that while conspiracy theories are endemic to American history and they've always been with us, they often accompany, technological changes. One of the great sort of little tidbits that I found really fascinating is in the 1830s, there's a minor but important innovation in printing technology that suddenly allows you to print things a lot cheaper than before. And so a small group of abolitionists are able to capitalize on this printing innovation to send anti-slavery leaflets to darn near every household in the South, just because it's suddenly cheaper. The white slave owners in the South who don't understand this technological shift immediately seize upon this as a conspiracy theory that somehow the abolitionists are this massive network, this massive secret society that has infiltrated everywhere. So we're definitely in a moment where technology is exacerbating, I think, some of these things. But I do want to be clear in the book about not giving ourselves a pass. One of the co-founders of Twitter has this line about social media is that everybody looks at a car wreck. We kind of just can't help ourselves. What social media does is it says, "Oh, people like car wrecks. Let's give them more of that." And so we believe these things because we want to believe them. The people who believe them find a kind of existential comfort or affirmation or a pleasure in believing them. And the way out is going to involve some amount of regulation of people like Facebook and Twitter if we're lucky, but it's also going to require an attempt to address this desire, this existential need for conspiracy theories that so many of us seem to have.
When you looked at the history here, how do some of these conspiracies die or die out, or come down from their peak? Is there a successful strategy that opponents, people who are living closer to reality, take on? Is it just a matter of time and these things die out generationally? What have you found when you looked at the last couple hundred years?
Yeah, it's not great. A lot of times. So one thing is that these moral panics tend to take one of two routes. Either they will go to the courts, like Salem or the McCarthy hearings or the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, and people will go to jail. People will get convicted. People might even get executed, as with Salem, and then it will kind of die out from there. And if the courts are not amenable, then oftentimes these things end in riots. And I think January 6th is a great example of that. The conspiracy theory built this moral panic, this social panic about the election. Trump was not successful at swaying the judiciary. And so they took to the streets, and this is something that, again and again, you find riots sort of born out of, anti-Catholic conspiracy theories, anti-Jewish conspiracy theories over and over again. So in some ways, these things sort of burn out when they burn out. I think that what I wanted to do is really address the fact that almost as soon as these things die out, we tend to forget them. By the 90s, nobody really cared about the Satanic Panic. Nobody was thinking about it. Everybody just wanted to forget that it happened. It was a weird anomaly that really didn't affect
Wait,
anybody.
Real briefly, explain the Satanic Panic of the 80s.
And so in the 1980s, there many people became convinced that in daycares and suburban homes across the country, there were secret cabals of Satanists who were forcing children to participate in these sexual rituals that involved human sacrifice. The testimony entirely came from small young children who were coerced in very obvious ways to manufacture testimony that was not only not reliable, but it was on its face factually impossible. And yet testimony from these children was used to send dozens of people to jail who were given, lengthy, some people were given prison sentences, 10, hundreds of years, like really insane shit. But it was insane. And people spent decades. People lost custody of their kids and didn't see them for for 10, 15 years before they were finally able to get their freedom, because none of this was based on anything. And as soon as it kind of died out, famously with the McMartin preschool in Southern California, which was the kind of center of these allegations, and was the subject of the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history, that failed to produce a conviction. By the 90s, this had sort of, people had forgotten about it, and nobody wanted to talk about it. So when Pizzagate and QAnon reappeared, basically using the same playbook, everybody acted as though this was some sort of kooky fringe thing that nobody could possibly take seriously and wasn't worth our time, until a guy shows up with an AR-15 shooting up a pizza place,
Yeah.
And so what I want to do with this book is to impress upon people that we are prone to a kind of historical amnesia about these things. And it's the amnesia that allows the next one to build up, fuel like a forest fire. And if we are able to be more vigilant on these things, then when the next one comes along, we can get out ahead of it, hopefully.
Would you translate vigilance for me in a practical way, society, education, etc.? Because it's so interesting, Colin. We got to be vigilant, and I think it's certain people who will always be vigilant. But how do you stay vigilant? How do you increase education about these things? Because social media. You mentioned the Evan Williams quote there from Twitter, that social media is putting up these car crashes every 10 feet for us now, because they're like, oh, you love car crashes, we're going to feed you more and more and more because we think you're going to believe it, and eventually you do.
Yeah, I mean, vigilance takes it takes a lot of things. I mean, and partly I think it's just that sort of historical awareness that this is a replay of these things. QAnon is a replay of the Satanic Panic, and so when people are, I think when you confront somebody with the fact of like, we've gone through this before, it forces them, at least on some level, to put the bar for believability up a little bit higher, so that they're maybe not as susceptible. But simultaneously, I think you also have to understand that people believe these things because, as I said before, they do something for them. They want to believe. They're looking for permission to have a feeling. Again, like, you think of any garden variety racist who knows on some level that having a racist attitude towards the Jews is impolite, is not a thing he can do in polite society. But if you give him a conspiracy theory, the Jews control the media, then suddenly it seems like, oh, now my racism is justified and I feel better about it, So trying to understand what it is, I think with the current moral panic about trans people, to circle back to kind of where we started with this idea of groomers, I mean, people, I don't know, I think at some level people are afraid that their children are not going to turn out like them. They're not going to have the same values as them. They're not going to look like them. They're not going to believe, that causes some people some existential anxiety. And when you're having that existential anxiety about your own kid, even if your own kid is cis, is not interested in, being, or isn't trans in any way, you can still look at the kind of rise in visibility of trans Americans and their fight for equality and, happiness. And maybe you start to sort of fixate on that because it signals to you the way in which the children are under threat, and it gives a narrative towards your own anxiety about why your kid won't talk to you when she comes home from school. I don't It's that kind of stuff.
I mean, and you're certainly seeing it appear with the various aspects of the parental rights movement and the push to ban books in school libraries, etc. You cite a couple examples. I want to end here of people who's lost family members or spouses to these theories. And it's a question I often get, which is like, how do I ask questions or have a conversation with a loved one, a friend or a family member who is either entered the rabbit hole, gone deep down the rabbit hole? What did you find as you wrote this book about, I don't know, the most practical ways to approach that? Are there ways to pull people out of that rabbit hole? How do you converse with those people?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you have to understand is it's a long process. I think a lot of people think that, their racist uncle is going to show up for Thanksgiving and they're going to be able to drop that, one or two pithy comments and he's going to see the light of of his ways, and that's going to be it. And I fundamentally don't think that's true. I mean, I think of, like, for example, I think of, I am 100% pro-choice in all aspects. And I think of like somebody what would it take for somebody to convince me that we should outlaw abortion? Like nothing, so I'm not gonna go into a conversation with somebody where I know that their beliefs are so firmly held that I don't have a chance. Like what,
right.
what's the point? That we just yell at each
when
other.
Obama released his birth certificate, that didn't convince anyone who didn't believe that he was born in
exactly
Kenya.
right. Yeah. So instead it's a question of like, well, what is this belief doing for this person, right? What to believe that Obama was born in Kenya, what is that? Is that an anxiety about a Black man having power? Is that a refusal to believe that democratic policies are popular? Is that, like what is the thing what is the existential drive that is leading that person to embrace that conspiracy? What emotion does that conspiracy theory give that person permission to embrace? That's what I think the question is. And if you start there, if you start like, what is it doing for them? What is that emotion? What is it? Why does it make them feel good or safe to embrace that conspiracy theory? Then you can work on that emotion. You can, again, it's a long, slow process, but you can start to say, okay, are there other things that will give that person that same feeling, or, affirm them in the same way that aren't destructive, and sort of, kind of work backwards from there. I think that's the best.
So what you're saying is approach them more like a therapist and less like a debating society. You're not going to
exactly.
You're not going to use logic to argue them out of something.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think you need to have the facts on your side. I think you need to be ready to deploy them. But I don't think that barking facts at somebody has ever worked, because I don't think that's what this is about for these people.
Colin Dickey, it's been a pleasure talking to you, man. Appreciate the book. The book is Under the Eye of Power: How Fear of Secret Societies Shape American Democracy. It's a fascinating look at our history. And anyone who thinks they know about American history, this is a different narrative, a different way to connect the dots, and some really incredibly interesting, fascinating, scary at times, anecdotes about American society.
Thank you so much for having me on. This was a really great conversation. Thanks a lot.
Great.